It's the Brian Lehrer Show on WNYC. Happy New Year, everyone. And it's not just a new year, it's a new era, as it's Inauguration Day for Mayor Mamdani. The ceremony starts at 1 p.m., and we'll be here on WNYC with live coverage, including some of your calls after his inaugural address. But to make the segue from the past to the future, we'll start today with our recent hour-long look at the past 4 years and the legacy of Mayor Eric Adams, the good, the bad, the mixed, with a panel of journalists. And we pick it up here with Mayor Adams 4 years ago as he took office.
Good afternoon, my fellow New Yorkers. This morning I took the oath of office to become your mayor. Just after midnight in Times Square, with thousands of people gathered to ring in the new year.
And what a different time that was, right? With the city still in the throes of the COVID-19 pandemic. The Omicron variant was raging with 40,000 new cases a day. And there were the other problems that came with the pandemic. Here's a minute of how Mayor Adams tried to set a new direction at the start of that new year.
Yet, unemployment remains high. Crime is high. COVID cases are high again. So how do we get our city back? My fellow New Yorkers, the answer is simple. We will get our city back by making a commitment to each other right here, right now, beginning today. This would be our New Year's resolution. We will not be controlled by crisis. Instead, we'll make this city better every day through actions big and small. Getting vaccinated is not letting the crisis control you. Enjoying a Broadway show, sending your kids to school, going back to the office, these are declarations of confidence that our city is our own. Of course, government must do its job to allow New Yorkers to make these choices safely.
Mayor Adams on his first day in office, January 1st, 2022. We'll sample some more from that day one speech and a few things since as we discuss and digest the Eric Adams years now before we fully move on to the Mamdani years. We'll do this with an all-star roundtable of New York City journalists and with you. We have three guests who have all covered the Adams years throughout. WNYC and Gothamist political reporter Elizabeth Kim, New York Times Metro political reporter Jeffery Mays, and Ben Max, host of the Max Politics podcast and program director at New York Law School's Center for New York City Law. Hi, Liz. Hi, Jeff. Hi, Ben. And Liz, remind us, why was Mayor Adams elected, if we can turn back the clock 4 years and a little, mostly in the first ever ranked choice voting Democratic primary, right? Despite having a field of high-profile competitors, Maya Wiley, Andrew Yang, and the one the New York Times had endorsed, Catherine Garcia.
Well, as you reminded listeners, Brian, we were in the throes of a pandemic. And we were also coming off the height of the Black Lives Movement and the George Floyd protests in 2020. And what I remember about that race in 2021 is that early on, there were these dueling concerns. You know, for one thing, people were worried, how does New York City recover and come out of the pandemic? How does someone help the city reopen? And then there was this social justice question that was brought on by the Black Lives Movement. But then there was as there often is in these kinds of races, there was a turning point. And that turning point was a shooting in Times Square. There were 4 people injured. One of them was a child. And from that point forward, what happened was public safety became the overriding concern. And that was really, I thought, what catapulted Eric Adams into being one of the major contenders. Now, again, it was still close because he beat Catherine Garcia, his main competitor in that race, who was the former sanitation commissioner, by less than 10,000 points. So these two concerns of, wanting this sort of Uber manager technocrat was there among New Yorkers, but also this idea of this unease with crime rising in the city. Yeah. So Jeff Mays from the Times, I'm looking at the Times article from that day.
January 1st, 2022, by your colleague Emma Fitzsimmons, that reflected some of what the mayor was referencing in the clips, including the 40,000 per day Omicron variant COVID spike of that moment, and a 9.4% unemployment rate, more than double the national average. So I'm curious if you heard that day one speech that we sampled from as kind of a pep talk for the city more than a policy address.
Absolutely. I think Mayor Adams, one of his supporters believe one of his biggest accomplishments that they feel is often overlooked is the fact that he did inherit the city, as the pandemic was still going on. There were still lots of issues. Places were closed. There were lots of people still contracting COVID. There were concerns about safety, as Liz mentioned, on the subway, in terms of people feeling safe enough to use the subway. So I think through his tenure, that idea of him being at the helm of the city during this very difficult time, having to lead the city out of the pandemic. I talked to one of his former staffers today, and they said they thought that was one of his biggest accomplishments, but he doesn't get enough credit for leading the city during that difficult time.
So here's another clip from that day one speech. And yes, COVID was still the defining feature of public life in many ways. But Adams also made sure to address some of the perennial issues that tend to face the city and his intention to address those.
Our government has been dysfunctional for far too long, and it created its own crisis long before COVID. Whether it was crime-ridden communities, poor schools, economic inequality, or racial injustice, our problems have been normalized for generations while New York's government struggled to match the energy and innovation of New Yorkers. That changes today. I promise you one thing, New York. I will make our city better every day by making our city government better every day.
So Ben Max, looking back, did Adams have an agenda for any of those things that was strikingly new or aggressive for any of those perennial challenges he mentioned in that clip on day one: crime, poor schools, economic inequality, or racial justice?
I don't know if he had anything particularly revolutionary that he introduced, but I would say on several of those fronts he advanced some significant policy. Obviously, he was elected to, in large part, be a public safety mayor, and through the police department, they enacted a number of crime-fighting strategies. In the schools, he focused on literacy overhaul, and that's going to be one of his probably biggest legacy items, at least on the positive side, was taking a real focus on trying to improve literacy and reading rates in the early school years. And then on things like economic inequality, racial justice, I think one of his biggest focus areas was this combination of housing policy and economic development, and he's got a lot of achievements on both of those to point to. One of the sort of under-the-radar aspects of the Adams years, he gets a lot of credit broadly for housing policy, but he's done housing policy in something of a sort of fair housing policy lens. That includes the recent ballot measures that were passed by one of his charter revision commissions and the way that he passed the City of Yes for Housing Opportunity rezoning that increases housing supply across the city, which is something he ran on, this idea that especially wealthier and whiter neighborhoods in the city could not be exclusionary to new housing. But I would say on the crime front, to come back to the beginning of the point here, one of the things that happened in the Adams years, and we could, of course, get into a lot more detail on this, is that while he focused on some of these priority areas, he repeatedly undermined himself through his mismanagement of government, through some of the bad appointments that he made. The lack of a clear chain of command particularly hurt him with the NYPD, and it took years for the House to really get in order there after a lot of scandal and dysfunction that clearly held back some of the potentially good or clearly good policy that he was putting into place.
Some texts that are coming in. Listener writes, Adams' greatest legacy will be coining the term rat czar. Another one says, Adams lost me when he tried to balance the city on the backs of the libraries multiple times. Another one says, Adams added a lot of bike lanes. Appreciate that as a green pointer. Another one says, I'd be interested to hear your guest opinions on how Adams used and acknowledged race in his governance, specifically how he used his identity as a black man. And Liz, on that, on economic inequality and where it intersects with racial injustice, two of the terms he cited in that clip, Adams was, of course, only the city's second black mayor, and he always emphasized being from the working class as well. And you reminded me yesterday off the air of his campaign promise to enact an earned income tax credit. So can you take us back to that promise and its context, or respond in any way to that listener?
Sure, Brian. And this is a policy that I've written about a lot. And I wrote about it starting during the campaign. And it was something that I knew that Adams's campaign was interested in because I knew that they had talked to James Parrott. He's a veteran economist. He's long lobbied the city to expand the earned income tax credit because he believes that this is the fastest way to put real cash in the pockets of low-income working New Yorkers. And to the mayor's credit, he did that. And he not only did it, but he did it really in his first year. In order to do this, he needed to go to Albany. He needed to get permission from Albany to get the city to really more than double its contribution to this tax credit program. It went from $100 million to $250 million. And then the state also agreed to chip in its own money as well. And, the last I looked, I saw there was a press release that the mayor put out maybe like a year ago where he said that in total, that program has delivered $345 million to these low-income New Yorkers that have to apply. I mean, it's a program, it doesn't just go to you. You do have to apply. But to the city's credit, they did run an advertising campaign to help New Yorkers fill out their taxes. And part of it was to get people who qualified for a program like this to get the money.
Jeff, any thoughts from you in any direction on how Adams tried to lean into the distinction of being the second black mayor and use that distinction or his life experience to aim for more racial justice and less economic inequality, which tends to run along racial lines in New York?
Yeah, I think Mayor Adams, from almost the start of his term, sought to place himself in the lineage of David Dinkins. Had been, over 30 years since the city has had a black mayor and David Dinkins. And a lot of people believe, time has sort of changed how people viewed Mayor Dinkins. A lot of people believe there were accomplishments, successes that were downplayed, that maybe he was treated harshly in some instances where he shouldn't have been treated. Looking at a lot of his accomplishments that came out, such as sort of addressing crime and Times Square, the tennis center, those were things that people came to appreciate about David Dinkins later, as well as the fact that he took over the city at a time of serious racial animus and made it his goal to sort of bring New Yorkers together. So in a very powerful way, Eric Adams, really tried to place himself in that lineage, especially when he got into trouble. There was one point where he was going around calling himself Dinkins 2, which was pretty striking. And he made the point that David Dinkins was treated unfairly, and that the accomplishments that he was making were not being viewed fairly. So he talked about things like increasing the minority women business program. He talked about the diversity of his administration, which is true. He had a lot of women of color in positions for the first time where they had never been in city government before. The problem with the comparison, many people thought, was that it did a disservice to David Dinkins, who was never accused of any serious corruption. There was one sort of investigation into some stock transfer with his son that amounted to not much. But Eric Adams faced serious charges of corruption, was the first modern mayor in New York City history to face indictment. And on top of that, many people in his administration also faced federal investigation. So I give the mayor was a master at talking about this issue in terms of a racial lens, and especially sort of trying to use that to his advantage. And I think it worked in a lot of ways. You know, up until the very end, black voters were his strongest supporters. You know, It wasn't until he began aligning himself with President Trump on issues that you saw black support start to finally peel away. And I think what it says about New York City is interesting that we've only had 2 black mayors, and it's been 30 years. It was 30 years between those 2 black mayors in a city that considers itself very progressive and forward-looking.
Interesting that you brought up corruption, his corruption issues in the middle of that answer, which was largely otherwise about policy. And so interestingly, we have 2 texts that are almost identical to each other, but from 2 different phone numbers, but referencing the same dark joke from the past. And this one says, setting aside the corruption, how has the Adams administration done, is a little like asking, other than that, Mrs. Lincoln, how did you like the play? So we'll get more into the corruption scandal history as we go. But Liz, Jeff referenced Adams comparing himself to Dinkins, less maybe in terms of what he tried to do at a policy level or somewhat with that, but maybe even more so on how he was perceived or how he was covered. And one way that Adams explicitly brought up race, as Jeff was indicating, was in criticizing his press coverage. So here's a clip from February 2022, just 1 month into his term, after he failed to win bail reform rollbacks during meetings in Albany.
I'm a black man, that's the mayor. But my story has been interpreted by people that don't look like me. We got to be honest about that. How many blacks are in the editorial boards? How many blacks are determining how these stories are being written?
And so, Liz, I'm going to turn right back to you on this because you were in the room for his weekly news conferences for basically all of those 4 years. He's undoubtedly right about the stats, I imagine. But do you think that kind of critique, which he would come back to periodically, influenced how he was covered, either with more racial sensitivity or as someone who was using the issue unfairly as a cover?
I'm so glad you played that clip, Brian, because, like you said, it's a month into his term, and it's a reminder of how early he brought up this issue. I mean, it did intensify, especially, post-indictment, but very early on, he brought up this issue of race and raised questions about whether a mostly white press corps could cover him fairly. Now, like you said, I don't doubt the statistics that he cites. And, this was something that I wrestled with, too, in the room watching him, because I don't doubt that, the coverage, the perception of him is shaped by race. I think that it's very hard to say that is not a lens with which we all view the world, right? But just like Jeff said, he was very masterful in the way he used race to put the press corps on the defensive. And I think he was largely successful in really shielding himself from maybe some even tougher questions that he should have gotten, because he put, like I said, it was largely a white press corps on the defensive, because again and again, he would bring up this question of race. And I thought another way he used it really well, and I think this is also partly who the mayor is, too, and his backstory, but his insistence on decorum and how reporters should talk to him. And that was something that he instilled in that, once he started doing those regular City Hall press conferences in the Blue Room, would come up again and again. And what it does is that it really puts the press corps on their heels, because he's saying, you can't talk to me this way. And it makes it a lot tougher to really grill the mayor.
We'll continue in a minute with the Eric Adams years on WNYC before we segue into the Zohran Mamdani years. Stay with us. As we look back at the Adams years, again a reminder that we'll be here for live coverage of Mayor Mamdani's inaugural ceremony and inaugural address, which is scheduled to start at 1 o'clock. But this Adams segment was recorded earlier, so no calls right now. Brian Lehrer on WNYC as we discuss the Eric Adams years in New York City. Before segueing into the Zohran Mamdani years, our guests are WNYC and Gothamist political reporter Elizabeth Kim, New York Times Metro political reporter Jeff Mays, and Ben Max, host of the Max Politics podcast and program director at New York Law School Center for New York City Law. Ben, if COVID was the crisis that defined the beginning of Adams' term, the mass migration of asylum seekers to the city largely defined the middle of his term, I think we can say, and then became entwined with his defense and his corruption scandal and the eventual dropping of the charges, or at least suspension of the charges, by the Trump administration. Now, to set this up, here's one more clip from his Inauguration Day speech in which he recalls the fiscal crisis of the 1970s to proclaim that nothing can destroy this city.
When this city was facing a financial crisis that set it on the verge of ruin, Mayor Koch said, "These have been hard times. We have been tested by fire. We have been drawn across the knife edge of poverty. We have been inundated by problems. We have been shaken by troubles that have destroyed any other city would have destroyed. But we are not any other city. We are New York."
We are not any other city. We are New York. Other cities would have been destroyed. Use that word by issues that he cited there. But the next year, he was singing a different tune. Here's one of the most memorable sound bites from the Adams years from September 2023.
"Never in my life have I had a problem that I did not see an ending to. I don't see an ending to this. I don't see an ending to this. This issue will destroy New York City. Destroy New York City."
So, Ben Max, how do you begin to assess how Mayor Adams handled the surge of asylum seekers and why he used that phrase, destroy New York City?
Yeah, so this is really the defining crisis, at least the not self-inflicted one of Eric Adams' term, and every mayor gets at least one big crisis out of their control, it seems. So I would say a few things on this that are worth thinking about. One, to connect it to the prior topic, there's a through line of Eric Adams doing a lot of excuse-making, lashing out, blaming other people for issues that he was confronting, sometimes with validity, sometimes without. And so when we talk about things like how he approached the press or how he discussed his record in Albany, which was, part of the prior clip you played about, lashing out at the press, or the migrant crisis or many other things, there is a lot of excuse-making, divisive commentary like that this issue would destroy the city and so forth. On this issue in particular, there's a couple of ways of looking at this. One is this is an immense challenge, very difficult to have well over 200,000 migrant asylum seekers come to the city over the course of a few years and need services and shelter and largely unable to work, as Adams regularly pointed out. So it was a mixed bag in terms of the logistical and the humanitarian response here, but there is a lot of room to give credit to the administration for many steps they took to provide services to people. There were a lot of trial and tribulation along the way, including some issues with how some people were treated, challenges with picking sites and sort of sometimes wasted energy or resources on setting up encampments that had to be taken down and things of that nature. But they clearly did a very big lift on the logistics and the humanitarian aid. You can also raise questions about whether they stayed in crisis mode too long or didn't provide enough legal services and things of that nature. But on the broader issue of how a mayor leads the city through a crisis, Eric Adams really failed on this. And the clip you played is really essential to that. He did a lot of talking about sort of us versus them, He did a lot of blame casting. And while the federal government under President Biden clearly should have been a lot more helpful to the city, and then towards the end of the Biden years, they did close down the border essentially far too late in terms of sort of getting their arms around this. Eric Adams did not handle this well and did not portray a strong sense of leadership and that he had his hands on the wheel, so to speak, to the city. And I think this is part of the root of why his approval numbers were tanking well before he was indicted, was that he did not show strong leadership during this moment of crisis and was seen, I think, by many New Yorkers as casting blame on migrants and speaking particularly divisively a lot of the times. Meanwhile, he was doing what one of the listeners texted, cutting library funding and going through all sorts of battles that other New Yorkers viewed as either unnecessary or particularly unhelpful.
Of course, there were some other texts coming in about positive things that he did. One, the Adams initiative to get loose garbage bags off the streets into bins will be a major improvement in city life. If it works, another listener writes, no fan of Adams, but bias and racial/racist double standard in New York City news media coverage is real and obvious, not only as it relates to politics, but to everything else, including crime. We're going to get to crime as a separate topic here. Listener asks, does the panel have any thoughts or reflections on how Adams' mayoralty might have led to the re-election of Trump? We'll talk about that. But Liz, same question that I just asked Ben. How do you begin to assess how Mayor Adams handled the surge of asylum seekers and why he used that phrase, destroy New York City?
You know, one of the feelings I've always had with Adams, and it came pretty quickly, was that my sense of him was that the way he wanted to do the job was he wanted to be, you know, what I remember talking to this one government veteran who told me that, you know, there are two kinds of mayors. You can be an outside mayor where you're sort of out there cheering the city on, or you can be an inside mayor where you're very, very steeped in all the policy and all the political decisions that are coming out of City Hall. And my sense was that Eric Adams, with the one exception of policing and public safety, wanted to be an outside mayor. He wanted to be out there for the ribbon cuttings. He wanted to be out there giving press conferences, you know, interacting with the public, because those were the things he was actually really good at. He had a lot of natural charisma. But what you saw early on as a result of this is there was this strange dichotomy. There was Eric Adams and what he would say on the podium about migrants and the migrant crisis, and then there was actually what his administration was doing on the ground. So I find for me, it's difficult to assess, you know, something like how he handled the migrant crisis, because I think you can make the argument that if you look on the ground and how they stood up all of those hotels, and even this concept of coming up with a welcome center where they kind of centralized a place for all the migrants to check in, you know, at the Roosevelt Hotel. I mean, the city did that on a very short time period, and they processed a lot of people. They helped a lot of people with their applications. But then, you know, you had the mayor who's at the podium and who's saying things like the clip you played, which is completely undermining the actual policy making that's coming out of his administration. Now, you can make the argument that at the end of the day, you know, the mayor is responsible for all of it. He's responsible for the rhetoric and he's responsible for the policy. I just don't know, how do you reckon with both of these dueling opposite kind of, you know, directions of his administration?
And here's a text before I ask you the same question, Jeff. Why didn't Adams do a better job of blaming Southern GOP governors sending migrants with one-way tickets to New York City and blue states? But same question generally on your take about how he handled the surge of asylum seekers and why he used that phrase, destroy New York City.
Yeah, I think the mayor was strongly focused on this crisis. He recognized how difficult this would be for the city, you know, as migrants were bussed into the city and sent to the city and began flooding the city. You saw a space for individuals in shelters who need help, you know, sort of longer time city residents being blocked up. So I think the mayor was focused on this. They did do a good job of opening shelters very quickly, which is a very complicated task. And, as the mayor often likes to point out, there were not like encampments on the street of migrants who had no housing. So I think he gets credit for that. I just think he made a series of errors that raised concerns about his management abilities, for example. Attacking President Biden at that moment did not necessarily appear to be something that you might want to do when you are asking for more assistance from them. Secondly, a lot of people believe he wasn't innovative enough in this crisis. A lot of times a crisis, I think it was Barack Obama who said that you use a crisis as a time for innovation, a time to make change. I know for a fact that advocates were saying, hey, let's change our voucher laws. Let's change the system. Let's get more people into permanent housing, and that would clear up space in the shelter system. People like Christine Quinn, who runs WIN, a shelter for women, was saying this many times. Let's make changes. Let's use this crisis to make changes in how we treat people in the city. Again, the city was slow to set up centers to help migrants apply for asylum. One of Mayor Adams' biggest complaints was that you had migrants here who could not work, legally could not work. But many of those people had asylum claims that would have potentially allowed them to work while they were here. The city was very slow to set up those centers to begin processing people's sort of claims of asylum. And I think he just made a series of other mistakes. I think as a mayor, you don't want to show the sort of fearfulness that he showed and played in that clip that you played about that this is going to destroy the city. Certainly, New York City is a city of immigrants, and we have historically absorbed large numbers of newcomers to the city. So to say that this crisis was going to destroy the city, a lot of people felt like the mayor just lacked imagination and creativeness in sort of how he spoke about that. He also made a number of mistakes where I think he linked migrants to crime, which, all statistics show that's not true, that, most people who are immigrants to this country actually have lower rates of committing crimes than other people. So I think while they have some accomplishments and this was a huge crisis, right? Buses were flooding in, hundreds of people were showing up every day. So it was a difficult crisis, but I feel like it sort of tested the mayor's ability to manage the city, which a lot of people had raised questions before he was elected because he had only been a borough president before becoming mayor of the largest and most complex city in the country.
Jeff, to that point you just made about him associating, and maybe wrongfully, migrants with crime, it kind of goes to that question we got in the text message from the listener who wanted to know if you thought that the way he dealt with the migrant crisis helped lead to the re-election of President Trump. I don't know if it, could have influenced that many people who were voting in swing states like Pennsylvania or Wisconsin, but any thought on that?
I think it certainly served a lot of Republicans to have the black Democratic mayor of New York City sort of talking about migrants in the same way that you found a lot of Republicans talking about migrants as a danger, as a nuisance, instead of how New York City has traditionally looked at immigrants as a asset, as people who start their own businesses, people who do jobs that other New Yorkers don't necessarily want to do, who work long hours, who are law-abiding. So that really was a real mistake on his part. And I think it hurt him with his base. Mayor Adams had a very interesting base coming into office, a lot of immigrants, Haitian immigrants, people from Africa. So if he's equating migrants with crime and, just talking about them in this way as a nuisance to the city, as something that's going to destroy the city, that really turned off a lot of his supporters who actually helped him win office in the first place.
And Brian,
Peter, go ahead, Ben.
It wasn't the exact question that the listener asked, but it absolutely, in my view, contributed to Republican gains in New York in the House races at that time that helped ensure a flip of the House. And Adams then was talking about how Democrats weren't delivering, and that was part of the reason for Democratic losses in that election. But he previously had contributed to the atmosphere that voters, I think, held Democrats responsible for previously.
Now, I think Peter in Newark has some thoughts about the Adams years before we segue into the Mamdani years. Peter, you're on WNYC. Hello.
Thank you. I think Adam overall was a good mayor. He got less credit than he deserved. He took us from COVID. He cleaned up New York City. Everybody's now happy to go on the subway. Everybody forgot that. The first thing a leader needs to do is to secure the city. And he did it. Everybody can walk around. You guys forgot that. The crisis he had with immigrants, what other mayor had it and was successful? He complained about Biden opening the border and not helping him. You guys forgot about that? Which other mayor confronted that huge crisis? Nobody. I think because he was black, people gave him less credit than he deserved. He did a whole lot of things that was good. And everybody's complaining. Every mayor has their own problem. Corruption, he was never convicted. The whole corruption is alleged. Was he went to court? Everybody is innocent in their conviction. What's his conviction? What did he do as a mayor? De Blasio had a problem, too, with the campaign reform. The U.S. Ferrari and exonerated him. Cuomo had issue with the appointment of the corruption committee. When he came to him, he dissolved them. Mayor Adam on every issue was good. Mamdani promised all this promise. Where is he going to get the money? We're going to see what's going to happen.
Let's hold the Mamdani thoughts till later, but thank you very much for all that on Adams. Arnaldo in Brooklyn may have some different opinions. Arnaldo, you're on WNYC. Hello.
Hi, Brian. I just want to say that I always hated the fact that the mayor always compared himself to David Dinkins. Look, I wasn't a supporter of David Dinkins, but I think David Dinkins was an honest man, a really classy guy. And that is the wrong comparison. The mayor, and I knew this even before he became mayor, he was really just exactly like Jimmy Walker, the mayor of New York in the 1920s, the Irish mayor. And that mayor was the same as he is. He loved the nightlife. He loved dressing very well. And both of them had been state senators. And in the end, Jimmy Walker is found to be involved in a big scandal and has to leave office and go off to Europe. And basically, it's not a question of whether you've been convicted. It's a question of all the obvious corruption and cronyism that there was in this administration. And that's all I have to say.
Arnaldo, thank you very much. Fair or not, interesting historical comparison to Jimmy Walker. Marty in Yonkers, you're on WNYC. Hi, Marty.
Hi, I'm a registered dietitian, and I moved back to the New York area in 2021. And I was looking for a couple of jobs, and I have to say that I was very impressed with the plant-forward thinking that was going on through the Adams administration as far as working with the medical systems in New York. There really wasn't anything that I had seen the last couple places that I had lived where there was this thought of, if we want long-term care and if we want to help people get out of this and now return to our hospital, we need to think about their long-term diet. And I just thought that was very impressive. And I got to work with am looking at projects now to work with people who are either leaving the mayor's office. And I just think that was a really wonderful thing to come into. And I've been doing nutrition research for over 20 years. And we just know that if you bring more plants in, you're going to decrease the risk of these chronic diseases that we have, including dementia. So I just thought it was really forward-thinking.
Thank you very much. And Noah in Brooklyn, you're on WNYC. Hi, Noah.
Hi there, Brian. Thanks for taking the call. So I was actually part of a immigration rights organization, no longer work there, but we were there in the ground at Port Authority first receiving asylum seekers. And I will say firsthand, and I'm not representing this organization anymore, but I will say my experience, the Adams administration lacked just basic, not even administrative or logistical function, but like event planning capacity. Like they didn't have the ability to throw a birthday party, let alone an immigration influx response and intake. They were relying largely on nonprofits and volunteers, and clearly we're not ready. And I know some people may say, oh, who had to deal with this before? If you're signing up to be mayor of New York City, you're signing up for potentially anything, and you make contingencies. And for someone who, allegedly, protected the streets of New York for 20 years as a New York City police department officer, Adams really just was not thinking about all the possibilities for the welfare and safety of these new New Yorkers who are receiving. And I also just want to note that I'm a little concerned by how many things have been mentioned here about crime in this conversation y'all have been having, and just sort of taking the unchallenged and unexamined premise that policing actually has anything to do with public safety, because that's not a data-supported conclusion, and certainly not in the case of the NYPD, which, even during its slowdowns has seen crime decreases regardless of what they do. So, yeah, I'm very happy to see Adams go and excited to see what Zoran does. Thanks for taking my call.
Noah, thank you very much. And I don't think in this hour we're going to get into the real, nuts and bolts of how much policing does to knock down crime versus other things. But Noah, thank you for your call. Thanks to everybody in that set of callers. And then as we continue on the timeline, when Adams was charged with corruption by the Biden Justice Department, he claimed it was political payback for his criticisms of the president on the migrant surge. And then the Trump Justice Department, as you all know, suspended those charges, saying even in a court filing that it was so he could help them with their deportation agenda. If you never heard the exact quote, I'm going to read it here. I have the actual brief open and from the Trump administration, and it says the pending prosecution has unduly restricted Mayor Adams' ability to devote full attention and resources to the illegal immigration and violent crime that escalated under the policies of the prior administration. Again, inability to devote full attention and resources to the illegal immigration and violent crime, hanging that on the pending prosecution. So was it a political quid pro quo? I'm going to play a memorable soundbite from earlier this year when the mayor appeared on Fox and Friends with border czar Tom Homan, and they had this little exchange, which begins with the host, Steve Ducey.
You are sitting today talking about the new alliance between ICE and Adams. So thank you very much for coming.
Thank you. Alliance was never severe.
Yeah, and if he doesn't come through,
you're up early anyway.
If he doesn't come through, I'll be back in New York City, and we won't be sitting on the couch. I'll be in his office, up his butt, saying, "Where the hell is the agreement we came to?"
The agreement we came to. So ultimately, the court closed the case permanently and ruled that, quote, everything here smacks of a bargain. Jeff, how much do you think that whole intersection between Adams' responses to Trump and Biden immigration policy and how his corruption case went is the reason we're not sitting here today previewing Eric Adams' second term rather than anticipating Mamdani's?
Yeah, that interview was particularly disastrous for him. Talking to other political leaders in the city, I did a story about how black political leaders felt embarrassed for him having to sit there and endure those comments from Tom Homan. And it was one of the reasons that I think, he lost even more support. It led to questions of whether he was compromised. Governor Hochul had to come intervene and sort of help with personnel decisions because there was concerns about him being compromised. We had, several top officials in his administration who resigned because they were concerned that the charges against the mayor were being dropped and that he would be beholden to President Trump for dismissing those charges. And so, as I was talking to people preparing for this interview today, they often cite that moment as just one of the moments where people felt like his mayoralty was done. To be the mayor of the largest, most important city in the country and to appear to have the federal government saying that they control you was just damage that I don't think he could come back from.
Liz Kim, same question.
No, I agree with Jeff. I think that ultimately you can make the argument that the perception of a quid pro quo, the allegation from a top federal prosecutor that there was a quid pro quo, was more damaging than the indictment itself, for him politically at least, and his ability to run for re-election.
Ben, anything to add?
Well, I would just say, I think it's important in the historical record here to say there's, zero evidence that the Biden Department of Justice or the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District, Damian Williams, brought a case against Eric Adams as retribution for his criticism over the migrant crisis, as Adams alleged. There's, zero evidence of that, and it appears that the, investigation had opened well before that incident, that crisis unfolded, and Adams started to criticize Biden. And then lastly, I would say there's whether there was a clear quid pro quo, or as Tom Homan said, the agreement we came to, there was obviously an understanding at play here, and that helped torpedo any last support Eric Adams had. And this idea, as Jeff got at, that he then saw this wave of departures from some of his best appointees of the administration, people with real policy expertise and accomplishments and integrity like Maria Torres Springer and Mira Joshi and others, again, reinforce so much of what voters already saw in Eric Adams, with so much controversy and the turnover in his administration, so many police commissioners and others leaving the administration. There were these close friends of Eric Adams who he appointed to positions that are, again, a through line of these Adams years, whether it was Tim Pearson or Phil Banks and others, that undermined so much of what he otherwise was trying to do, that were embroiled in their own set of controversies and investigations.
And Brian, can I just add, those concerns continued even through the mayor's tenure. There was one point where he started speaking out about the use of bathrooms, gender identity, and, who should be allowed to use bathrooms in our schools. And, they were talking points that seemed directly from Republican politicians in this country. And there was just a lot of concern about how the dismissal of the indictment may have affected the remainder of his tenure and his positions, and that some people believed he was compromised. Of course, the mayor says that's not the case. He has strongly denied that. But you can't help that perception was out there, and people acted on it, leaving very good jobs because they were concerned about not being tarnished with this administration.
Catherine on the Upper West Side, you're on WNYC. Hi, Catherine.
Good morning, and thank you, Brian, and all. I think one of his greatest failures was not to follow through on de Blasio's arguably greatest, unprecedented in the country achievement, free pre-K. Adams would have had to have the organizational ability, the will, to promote it in the poorest neighborhoods. He left so many neighborhoods and schools uncovered and unexposed the ability to access this. And I think that was an enormous failure for the first allegedly working class mayor.
Catherine, thank you very much. So, Liz, to Catherine's point, and also to Adams on education generally, I think some people see him as being successful for having restored phonics-based reading instruction. We know he came in, at least, talking about his own history of dyslexia as a child and how he was going to try to address those kinds of disabilities better. I don't know if the racial disparity in educational outcomes got reduced under his watch, but education, of course, is such a gigantic topic. The caller points to one aspect, universal or not, pre-K and 3K.
No, I think that's right, Brian. In many ways, what the caller said was, yes, that expanding that program of universal pre-K would have been a policy slam dunk for Adams, particularly given his base. Now, what the mayor said at the time was he said that this program had been so mismanaged that there were certain neighborhoods in which you had empty seats, and the city was paying for that. And then we knew, based on reporting, that there were other neighborhoods where there was a lot of demand and not enough seats. But what the mayor did, which is what the mayor did repeatedly, was he was fixated on blaming the prior administration for this rather than attending to the problem at hand. He had an opportunity to really fix this. And ultimately, there was a lot of negotiation with the city council, and they did come to agreement that they were going to try to do more, just like the caller said, to promote these programs. A lot of experts said that no, the reason why we're not attracting enough children to these seats is because we're not advertising them in the right areas. We need to be going to, salons. We need to be going to churches. So by the time the mayor finally got around to that, it was already too late. In the court of public opinion, he had failed on what many people thought was one of the city's, most biggest achievements in education, which was establishing universal pre-K.
It's the Eric Adams years on WNYC before we segue into the Zohran Mamdani years. And when we continue in a minute, we'll turn to one more very defining issue for Adams that also makes a very specific segue to Mamdani. Stay with us. As we look back at the Adams years, again, a reminder that we'll be here for live coverage of Mayor Mamdani's inaugural ceremony and inaugural address, which is scheduled to start at 1 o'clock. But this Adams segment was recorded earlier, so no calls right now. Brian Lehrer on WNYC as we are debriefing the Eric Adams years now before we segue into the Zohran Mamdani years. And last issue from the Adams years, crime. One major piece of continuity from the Adams to the Mamdani era will, of course, be the retention of Jessica Tisch as police commissioner. Here is Commissioner Tisch in September, boasting to Dan Menorino of Pix 11 how successful the Adams administration has been on that, despite some ongoing challenges, especially in the Bronx this summer.
A lot of it, Dan, is gang violence, and the mayor has been very clear with us. He wants us to go after gangs and guns, and we have done that in a big and frankly historic way this summer and this year. We have more gang takedowns this year than we have ever had in NYPD history. More guns off the street over the past 3.5 years under the mayor than ever in history. So those two ingredients, going after gangs, going after guns, in addition to having lots of cops out in foot posts, precision policing in the right places, that has led to the historic crime declines that we are discussing today.
Commissioner Tisch in September. And one more time, our guests are WNYC and Gothamist political reporter Elizabeth Kim, New York Times Metro political reporter Jeffery Mays, and Ben Max, host of the Max Politics podcast and program director at New York Law School's Center for New York City Law. And Ben, since you're sitting there at a law school and the topic at the moment is crime, how much can we say that despite anything else, Mayor Adams has largely been successful on his signature issue, public safety?
Well, I think it's much more of a mixed bag than voters expected when they elected Eric Adams as mayor is the sort of big picture takeaway here. There have been some very encouraging recent trends, but it took quite a bit longer than I think Eric Adams himself expected or many voters expected for some of the crime numbers to trend down. And much of it is still above pre-pandemic levels, but they've made some progress over the last couple of years. Eric Adams expected to make much more quick progress, but things like car thefts and assaults continue to rise rapidly under his watch for quite a while. But there's been some recent progress. And again, raising the question about, as a caller got at, how much of this is about what the NYPD doing is how much of it is about broader trends. And that relates to the debates over New York State criminal justice policy and its impact on crime. And we saw throughout the COVID era, crime increases across the country in places they didn't make those changes. So there's a lot to unpack here. But I think There's some significant trends in the right direction recently on crime numbers. And of course, that's part of the reason Mamdani has sought to retain Commissioner Tisch. But also, the functioning of the police department relates to the questions about appointments, chain of command, and cronyism and corruption that plagued the Adams years. And that's part of why Tisch has also been credited by Mamdani and others for cleaning up the department.
Liz Kim, same question.
This is another instance in which the mayor's rhetoric really undermined him. And in this case, it was really quite mystifying why he would do this. Early on in his term, he talked about crime as being out of control. And we knew from just looking at the statistics, and this was coming from a police officer who worked in an era where there was much higher crime in the city. But he was talking as if this was the highest crime rate the city has ever seen, despite the data saying something quite different. And then there was this idea where he put a lot of stock in perception. Not to say that it's entirely wrong, but it took him a really long time because he was so invested in how people were perceiving safety that it took him a long time to really try to get the public to believe in the data, because he kept saying, if you don't, it's not enough, it's not enough to be safe. You have to feel safe. Now, that is, that's not to discount the importance of perception, but there's so many factors that go into how someone feels safe. So I think that was a problem. I think that, yes, like Ben said, the caller made an excellent point. You can argue that, all major U.S. cities saw a drop in crime following the pandemic. Like, New York has not been different in that respect. So how much credit do you give the surge in policing? And yes, at the same time, shootings and murders are down, but we've also seen very disturbing rises in other types of crime, like felony assaults. My colleague Charles Lane has reported that felony assaults are actually up 80% since 2008. So it's a mixed picture, I would say. And I would say the other thing that the mayor tried to introduce a conversation about how policing can respond to mental health. But I feel like that is still an unfinished policy conversation in New York City.
Yeah. So Jeff, how much do you think the Mamdani administration will be trying to undo Adams' policies with respect to crime prevention versus just doing things of their own?
Yeah, it's going to be very interesting to see how Mamdani meshes with Jessica Tisch, who is to the right of him on certain issues like the effect of the raise the age law, bail reform, the extensive use of surveillance in the city that advocates have raised concerns about. So Mamdani has said he expects his commissioner to sort of follow his direction. We're going to see how that actually works out. I think with Eric Adams, one of the reasons he got elected, as Liz mentioned, is that his background as a police officer, gave a lot of people comfort at a time where, there were concerns, about riding the subway, about a number of mentally ill people, unfortunately, on the subway. And so that helped Mayor Adams get into office. He made the promise that he could police the city, but at the same time, not violate people's civil rights. And what we've seen under him instead is an increase in the use of stop and frisk, much of which, according to the federal monitor, has been illegal stop and frisks. So we're hearkening back to, 2014, those type of the highest numbers since 2014 when, Mayor Bloomberg, Mayor de Blasio began winding down the use of stop and frisk. So I think that's one issue that will sort of dog his record on crime. At the same time as murders are dropping, we're seeing an increase in rapes in the city. I'm not sure the city has solved the issue with the NYPD and the bureau that investigates rapes. And finally, I think as Mayor Adams promised to certain communities in the city, there are just certain communities in the city, 7 or 8 communities where most of the gun violence takes place. We're seeing a disturbing trend in killings of very young people, teenagers, people who are 12, 14 years old, senior citizens being shot in broad daylight. So I think that is also going to be part of the mayor's legacy.
And so ends the Adams years on WNYC. Before we segue into the Mamdani years, we thank WNYC and Gothamist political reporter Elizabeth Kim, New York Times Metro political reporter Jeffery Mays, and Ben Max, host of the Max Politics podcast and program director at New York Law School's Center for New York City Law. Thank you all so much for your reporting and your time today.
Thank you, Brian.
Thanks.
Thanks, Brian.
The Brian Lehrer Show is on tape this morning, but don't forget, we'll be here live a little before 1 o'clock when WNYC will have live coverage of Mayor Mamdani's inauguration. No calls right now, though. It's the Brian Lehrer Show on WNYC. Good morning again, everyone, and happy birthday to Wikipedia. The crowdsourced online encyclopedia turns 25 on January 15th. It hits that quarter-of-a-century mark as another political target of the American right, alleging Wikipedia is biased to the left. Some call it Wokepedia. Elon Musk even launched an AI alternative called Grokopedia. Never mind that Grokopedia told a user recently that Musk is more fit than LeBron James. But political division is hardly the only Wikipedia story. It has millions of articles, has logged billions of searches, appears in many languages. Like us, it's a not-for-profit information source, and it has now inspired co-founder Jimmy Wales to write a 25th anniversary book called The 7 Rules of Trust, a blueprint for building things that last. He sees trusting strangers as being at the core of Wikipedia's success. But way beyond Wikipedia, he addresses head-on the decline in trust that is such a defining feature of our country and our world, and he hopes to contribute to turning that around. Jimmy Wales joins us now. Jimmy, thanks for coming on. Congratulations on 25 years, and welcome back to WNYC.
Great. Well, thanks for having me on. It's an exciting time, and I'm kind of amazed. It's been 25 years. That's a long time.
Let's do a little of the origin story first for our listeners who may not know it. You started Wikipedia 25 years ago when your newborn baby was very ill, I see. Can you tell that story?
Yeah, so I had been working for about a couple of years on a project called Newpedia, which was the same vision to have a free, neutral, high-quality encyclopedia in all the languages of the world. Newpedia wasn't working. It was very top-down. It was very untrusting, actually. And I was getting very frustrated, and I was sort of near the point of giving up. And then my daughter was born and was very, very ill and in the hospital. It was quite a scary time, and one of the things I did as a frightened first parent is go to the internet to try and learn more about her ailment, and it wasn't very good. There were some academic papers which were too hard for me to understand. There was some random blog posts, and I really realized, we have to do this. We have to find a way to create a good encyclopedia that will help people in this situation. And kind of as a last-ditch thing, one of my employees had shown me the idea of Wiki, which just means a website anyone can edit. And I thought, you know what? And we just have to try it. So when I got home from the hospital on January 15th, launched Wikipedia. And, it seems to have worked.
The rest is history, but there's a lot of history there. Let me follow up on one
lot of history there. Yeah.
One aspect of that story, though. You said your original concept, Newpedia, was top-down, but as I understand it, in that formation, contributors would have had to show that they were experts in their field. So why did you think allowing anyone to write and edit about things as technical as a serious health condition for a newborn would produce better information than experts in their fields?
Well, at the beginning, it was just we have to do something to get started. And if you think about certain types of entries, you realize immediately that there aren't really a need for experts. So, here's an article about the the history of Paris. Okay, well, I think anybody, an intelligent person, could start writing some things. And I had assumed in the early days that we would have to have like an editor-in-chief of the medical section who would then, do all that. But as it turns out, there are different levels of expertise. A lot of people who are experts, medical experts and so forth, do come and they work in Wikipedia, they edit and they contribute their time. And then other people, lots of Wikipedians have become expert, not necessarily in that particular subject matter, but in writing an encyclopedia, which is also an important skill that I think a lot of people haven't really thought about very much. But I didn't know at the beginning. And, as it turns out, it's worked out pretty well.
This was a wisdom of the crowd's premise, or as you put it in the book, people should be able to talk and sort out disagreements. And you had to get strangers on the internet to cooperate and trust each other. There's that word, the theme of your book, right? Trusting. But considering the polarized world that we're living in today that you're trying to address, where, competing political and culture war camps can't agree on basic facts, never mind how to interpret their meaning or to trust each other to disagree in good faith, how much do you still believe your premise and how much do you think it turned out to be too idealistic, at least in some realms?
Well, I still very much believe in the premise. And I think, when we look at the culture wars and the political world and aspects of social media, it's very easy to get to a very dark view of human beings and of human nature and feel a bit, lost and hopeless. But then we can stop and think and remember all the day-to-day interactions and people we meet and people we know, and we may disagree with them, but we're able to be civil and we're able to have constructive dialogue. And I don't think it's impossible. I think it still is very much possible, and not only possible, but really necessary. When I looked at the recent, the longest ever government shutdown, which in my view was in no small part because the political parties aren't able to trust each other, to have a little bit of give and take, to say, look, you give us this, we'll give you that, next year we'll take care of you, let's figure out a compromise. Instead, it's sort of like nuclear ultimatums against each other. That's not useful. That's not a practical way to run anything, and we do need to get back to thinking about how do we build things that last? How do we find ways of recognizing the good in others and understanding each other a little bit better? And that's really what the book is all about. I'm hopeful.
And we'll get to the book, and I promise we will tick off all 7 rules of trust and talk about some of them. But continuing on the history and current state of Wikipedia a little bit, who tends to write and edit Wikipedia when it comes to political or culture war topics? I can tell you that hosting a talk show where we also believe in civil exchange among people who disagree, the people most likely to call in or text, certainly not all, but those most likely who are motivated enough to make the effort, tend to be the most opinionated people on any side of an issue, not those who trust anyone on the, quote, other side. So how much is that your experience with which members of the public participate in those topics on Wikipedia, and therefore how much you and others in leadership have to ride that?
Yeah, so, obviously, if there is a big controversial topic, and particularly if it flares up in the news or whatever, we will see sometimes a flux of incomers, people who, come with a war mentality and it's a battleground, I'm going to do this. But then they meet up with the regular Wikipedians who, in general, care far more about Wikipedia, about what we're doing, about the project, than they do about any particular fight. And in fact, one of the techniques that has been used in the past by the arbitration committee is to, have a period of moratorium where they basically ban everybody on both sides who have any kind of an opinion and invite in just good Wikipedians who aren't involved to try and sort out the issue. Now, obviously, that's a pretty extreme move, and that only happens from time to time. But broadly, I think it is really important that we cultivate within Wikipedia a culture and a community that is about, okay, let's be fair, let's be neutral, let's bring in, the accounts of all sides. and recognize that sometimes it's really hard because emotions are high and there are difficult issues. So it varies over time. But I mean, broadly, I would say the kinds of people who really are into Wikipedia, who are really here year in and year out, are just nerds, not particularly political, really interested in history and science and all kinds of topics. And I think that's really important. Those are the people that we should all elevate and value. And that's actually one of the problems with social media, is that those people don't get elevated and valued, and instead those warriors do.
Yeah. Let me ask you about one difficult example in that vein. Last night, preparing for this, I read, of all things, the Wikipedia page about your book. And one of the things that I learned was that you said on CNN that the Wikipedia page called Gaza Genocide was, quote, one of the worst Wikipedia entries I've seen in a long time. So I looked and I saw it was still up and presented genocide there as a fact, not as a label that's being debated. The entry starts, "The Gaza genocide is the ongoing, intentional, and systematic destruction of the Palestinian people in the Gaza Strip carried out by Israel during the Gaza war," unquote. So what to you made it a bad entry at the time you spoke to CNN? And I'm curious if you've checked it out since.
Yeah, so, I think for Wikipedia, we have a very, very strong commitment to neutrality. And the complaint that I have had, and I've launched a long conversation in the community, and that's still ongoing, about this, not just this article, about that question of neutrality. How do we make sure that we don't end up with this kind of a bad result? And what do we do about fixing it? Now, what doesn't happen, and this might surprise people, is I don't wade in like an Elon Musk and sort of, chop people down and sort of force my point of view through. It's always a dialogue. It's always a discourse. My view is very simple. If you don't have near unanimity in the community over such a very strong statement, then you shouldn't say it in the voice of Wikipedia. You should report very accurately on, there is some really serious, heavy-hitting people and groups of people and bodies who are calling this a genocide. You can't ignore that. You have to report on that. But you also have to report fairly that this is not a universal view, and that actually Wikipedia itself should never take a stand on a controversial issue. Like I say, it gets really hard in these cases where emotions are very high. People are very upset about what's been happening in Israel. I know I'm upset both about the original attacks by Hamas and then the response. And I mean, it's a human tragedy any way you look at it. But that doesn't mean that we should drop our principles and our values. We should really step back and say, look, even though this is something people are very upset about, we have to remain really calm, really neutral. We have to report fairly on all sides of the questions, and we should not be taking a side. So that's a conversation. I think if you check back in 6 months or a year, it'll be different. But yeah, I'm just one person. I'm just me, and I'm going to make my case as best I can.
Claudia in Ossining, you're on WNYC with Jimmy Wales, co-founder of Wikipedia. Hi, Claudia.
Good morning. Oh, am I excited. Thank you, Mr. Wales. I am a true believer. I couldn't say enough of respect toward Wikipedia. About 10 years ago, I was teaching sustainability at Pace University in Pleasantville in New York. I worked with one of the reference librarians, and we developed a whole class, an entire hour-and-a-half class on how do you use Wikipedia. Because the students at first were shocked when we suggested it. They said their high school teachers had mixed Wikipedia, which is a riot now when you think about AI. Wikipedia is so far superior, there's no comparison. But what we taught them were the things that most people wouldn't know about, like looking at the top banners, is it a contested site? Looking at the references at the bottom, looking behind the scenes at the transparent discussions like you're describing. And then last but not least, I love that map of the flags showing in real time all over the world where people are working on Wikipedia pages. I mean, it is such a democratic process. It's incredible. And the last thing I would just say on a personal note, my uncle, who was a Yiddish folk singer and passed away in 1987, I just checked. The last update to that page was in February of this year.
Wow.
So, it's alive, this product. It's beautiful.
Oh, well, thank you. That's all very kind. And, I think that question of, transparency, which is one of my 7 rules of trust, where we say, at the top, the neutrality of this article has been disputed, or the following section doesn't cite any references. It's a funny kind of thing how that increases trust. I mean, you would think telling people that this is not quite right, that would decrease trust, right? No, it actually increases trust because people say, oh, okay, well, that's good. I always joke, I wish the New York Times would sometimes run a banner at the top saying, we had a big fight in the newsroom about this, but we decided to run it, but just be aware some of the journalists weren't quite comfortable with it.
Here's a text kind of along the same lines as your fan who just called in. Listener writes, I was quite skeptical about Wikipedia in the beginning, really doubted how non-experts could arrive at truth or accuracy. That changed in 2012 when my middle schooler began editing the page for an obscure bird and embellished a few things. The Wikipedia staff gently corrected the entry. My child reinserted their original comments, and this went a few rounds until the computers they had used were blocked from editing for quite a while. That completely changed my view of Wikipedia's accuracy, and I now go there first when I'm learning about a new topic. I'll bet you like that one.
Yeah, that is good. And what's interesting, and I like in that story, this detail wasn't in there, but hopefully when somebody comes in and they do something, and it's often young people, and they do a little prank or something like that, of course, hopefully it gets corrected very quickly, but hopefully they get a pretty nice message saying, hey, don't do that. That's not really what we do here. And you don't get blocked right away. You get a little like, oh, hold on. Like, remember, we're trying to make an encyclopedia. There's a great story, which is in the book about Kaylana, a very well-known Wikipedian. Emily Templewood is her name. And she started out when she was very young by vandalizing Wikipedia, and then somebody was nice to her, and she felt so guilty. She sort of devoted a lot of time to making up for her mistake and doing a lot of good edits to Wikipedia, and really headed up, a project to add more women scientists to Wikipedia and things like that. And so there's all these great stories that come out of assuming good faith and saying, oh, okay, look, yeah, you did a prank, whatever, behave yourself and come on and join us. Like, it's actually more fun to do something productive.
It's interesting. I was just about to ask you your reaction to people who now call it Wokepedia, but then we got this text, which I thought was going to reinforce that view, but listen to where it goes. The person writes, this neutrality business, I agree that it's something to strive towards, but it's completely unrealistic to pretend like neutrality actually exists. Neutrality policies often tend to favor more mainstream. This is where the right goes as well. But this listener writes, neutrality policies often tend to favor more mainstream and right-leaning voices and suppress left-wing voices. So it is ironic that the right wing is so up in arms about Wikipedia. Mr. Wales himself, and you can contradict this if you want, Mr. Wales himself is a known right-leaning techno-libertarian. So your take on yourself, and also what do you think when you see it called by people on the right Wokepedia?
Yeah, well, I mean, I certainly would say my personal politics are completely irrelevant to almost everything in the world, except the only area I have any expertise in is freedom of expression and internet policy. But yeah, no, I mean, I think the idea that, okay, if you, and this has been expressed by the right quite a lot, that if you really focus on mainstream sources and reliable sources, you're going to exclude or negate minority opinions. It's something to grapple with. And clearly what you really want to do is to say, look, there is a received view, and it's very well backed by science, for example. And if there are dissenting views, they need to be treated fairly and thoughtfully, and they need to be explained. But you wouldn't elevate them for no reason into being, the mainstream. When people come to an encyclopedia, they really want to understand, like, what's the state of knowledge on this today? And you want to say, well, look, here's the main views, and here's this and that, and there are these dissenting views, maybe on the left, maybe on the right, and so on. That's really what an encyclopedia should do. Now, if you're writing your own book or you're writing a blog of opinion or whatever, then sure, by all means, pursue your passion and put down what you believe. But that isn't really what an encyclopedia should do. And you know what is interesting? As it turns out, a lot of people who are themselves pretty ideological often have a really strong capacity to do this, to say, look, I'm happy to work with someone who disagrees with me vehemently, as long as we're working together in a polite and friendly way, to explain the issue, because I'm quite sure if anybody understood the issue, they would probably side with me. And they might both be thinking the same thing, to say, yeah, let's explain the argument fairly, because then people will see. And I think it's people who are less confident in their own beliefs often, but still ideological, are the ones who are terrified to let the other side speak, and they really want something that's biased. So we're always looking for people who are confident in their beliefs and relaxed and able to say, well, look, epistemic humility, like I'm willing to listen to the other side. I'm willing to have a good discourse. It should be courteous. It should be, comprehensive. And I don't think there's any choice but to be neutral, because otherwise you end up with absolutely intractable problems where you just have to block people who disagree with you. And that doesn't really lend you to a good process of seeking the truth.
Yeah, and I saw on this critique that you apparently get from both sides about relying on mainstream sources for Wikipedia entries. I see that in your New York Times interview recently, you defended that in part by saying you won't apologize for prioritizing information from mainstream media and quality newspapers and magazines, as you put it. You told the Times, we're not about to say, gee, maybe science isn't valid after all. Maybe the COVID vaccine killed half the population. No, it didn't. That's crazy, and we're not going to print that. But that's part of the complexity of what you do, right? We deal with that question too. You want to maximize openness to multiple points of view, but at the same time, you want to say what's true and reject things that are false.
Yeah, exactly. And there are cases where that's easier and cases where that's harder. And I think in the cases where it's harder, the best thing to do is to, accurately and fairly summarize all the different points of view and, don't take sides.
Let's hear from some Wikipedia contributors. Mono on the Lower East Side. You're on WNYC with Jimmy Wales. Hi, Mono.
I am from Iran, and I was puzzled by some assassinations in Iran, which was clarified for me when I looked up assassination in Iran in Wikipedia. And then when I went back to read again the topic in Wikipedia, it had disappeared. How do things disappear from Wikipedia?
Mono, thank you.
Yeah.
And I think he told our screener
Great.
that he had added information and then found that disappeared. Jimmy, go ahead.
Yeah, great. So there is a page, I just looked it up, called List of Iranian Assassinations. I don't know how good it is. There's a banner at the top, very transparently saying this article has multiple issues, and you can go on the talk page and see. So one of the main reasons that information gets moved or disappeared is that, is there a quality source? And so just coming to write your personal experience isn't really, the right way to do it in Wikipedia. Oftentimes, something that someone wants to put in Wikipedia, they come in and they don't have a really good source and they don't have, good sourcing and so on and so forth. So unless it's encyclopedic and sort of has quality sourcing, then it will tend to go away. Oftentimes there's just editorial reasons that things get moved around. So maybe that information was added in one place and then it got moved and then you couldn't find it later, and that's unfortunate. So hard to say without looking into the specific example. If we look at there is a process called nomination for deletion, and then a deletion debate takes place. And, one of the things that happens here is it's unfortunate. Something gets nominated for deletion, which, by the way, any person on the planet can nominate something for deletion, and then a process takes place. And sometimes when that happens and there's a discussion ongoing, then I see, people on Twitter going crazy. Oh, Wikipedia is trying to delete this. And it's like, no, one person nominated it and there's a discussion. And by the way, so far, 2 hours in, it's sort of 40-1 that obviously we're going to keep this. So nothing to get excited about. It's just part of the process.
On a lighter note, I think, Susie in Astoria, you're on WNYC with Jimmy Wales. Hi, Susie.
Hey there. I'm on a really minor, but I've told it's important thing. I'm a punctuation princess.
Right.
So I will just dive into an article, or it'll come up and I'll just start putting commas everywhere. Sometimes I'm wrong and somebody gets back to me. I've written one article and it was on my failed PhD interest.
Oh, that's great. I love that. So are you probably one of those people who would have a pretty strong opinion about the difference between a dash and an M dash? Because that's something we fight about quite a lot.
Do you know I'm more interested in the Harvard/Oxford comma because I think that's where people get mad at me a lot. And commas,
that's great.
Oh, the big one, commas inside or outside of quotation marks. That's a weird debate. Weird debate.
That's a weird debate. I don't know where you come down. Because I am not very good, but I am a computer programmer. I tend to want those commas outside the quotation marks, but I know it's not always something people.
I want them
agree on.
inside, but I think that you win. Actually, in Wikipedia land, there are, for anybody that cares, there are a lot of rules. But anybody, as you said, anybody can do it. And there's meetups in New York where they say, "Come out, we'll teach you how to do it." And I have to say, the people in the New York Wikipedia scene, I maybe see them once or twice a year, they're so kind and so nice. And there's a wiki picnic every year just to do the social side of Wikipedia.
Yeah, that's something most people don't realize is that we do have, in-person get-togethers. And if you go and meet the Wikipedians, what you'll find we're like is just like really nice people. I mean, lovely, lovely people and very nerdy, And so, whenever I hear Wikipedia, I think, oh, you probably think you're going to some sort of, communist meeting or something. It's like, no, just some nerds really interested in. I mean, my favorite expression. I've just learned this. I've never heard it in my life. Punctuation princess. I'm gonna carry that with me. I love it.
Caller of the week, Susie. Thank you very much. Is Google AI hurting Wikipedia? It seems like Google is now an AI internet encyclopedia itself. Google searches don't just give us links anymore. I'm sure I don't have to tell you. They often begin with an entry on the topic written by AI. And I've read that it's hurting news organizations because fewer people click on the news organization links anymore. They increasingly see the Google AI summary, and that's enough for them. Is Wikipedia being affected in that way?
So it's really hard to tell. It's something we're looking into. We did note in a blog post a couple months ago, that we've seen an 8% decline in human traffic to Wikipedia, and also a corresponding increase in bot traffic, whatever that means. But there was a Pew Research study that looked at Google results and found that in traditional search results, the top 10 links as they've always had, Wikipedia appears about 3% of the time, but in AI summaries, Wikipedia appears and is linked to about 6% of the time. So to that extent, and this is very rough and an emerging and changing thing, you would say, well, we're getting, twice as many links as we used to get from Google, but people click through less often, maybe about half as often, which would be a net nothing for our traffic. And I think that something in that ballpark is probably correct. If you ask Google a question, well, 20 years ago, Google had no idea the answer to any question. It was just a search engine. Now, ask how old is Tom Cruise, and Google will tell you. But they also link to Wikipedia there. And so depending on what you're doing, you might just stop there. It's like, oh, I got the answer to my question. That's it. I'm done. I'm going to go back to what I was doing. In other cases, maybe you ask your question and you're like, oh, okay, that's from Wikipedia. Oh, actually, I've been thinking I wanted to go read more. So you go and you click and read more. So hard to say right now. I mean, certainly compared to some organizations, we haven't seen a super dramatic impact on our traffic. There's a tech website, Stack Overflow, where programmers go to ask questions and you know, oh, I've got this bug, how do I fix it, and so on. And their traffic, I read, is maybe 10% of what it was a few years ago, because the AI models are really good at answering your tech questions. So we haven't faced that kind of, you know, catastrophe, but it's hard to say. And I think it's a really interesting question, like what, as we see the changing use of the internet, you know, we faced the same kinds of questions several years ago with the rise of mobile. You know, I remember the moment when mobile page views on Wikipedia became more than half of our page views. And of course, if you're on a mobile phone, it's pretty hard to edit Wikipedia. So we thought, if everybody's on mobile now, are they going to stop editing Wikipedia? Well, that didn't happen. They didn't stop editing Wikipedia, but these changes are something that, you know, they're going to happen. And as Wikipedia, we just have to kind of roll with it and figure out, okay, what's our place in this ecosystem?
Okay. The book that you've published for the 25th birthday of Wikipedia, The 7 Rules of Trust, a blueprint for building things that last. And I'm just going to read out the 7. 1, make it personal. 2, be positive about people. 3, create a clear purpose. 4, be trusting. 5, be civil. 6, be independent. And 7, be transparent. Now, that sounds like it could be anything from a self-help book for salespeople to relationship advice, but I think you're hoping to address polarization in society. So how much is that your goal with the book?
It is a big goal. I mean, when we look at the Edelman Trust Barometer survey, which has been going on since about 2000, we've seen this enormous decline in trust in journalism, in politics, in business, in each other. And this is leading to all kinds of negative effects. And I think it's something that we need to address. I think it's really important that we step back and say, how do we rebuild a culture of trust? What are the things that we can do in our own lives, in our own organizations? What are the things we should insist upon with our leaders, our political leaders and businesses, to get back to a culture of trust? Because, you know, when you live in a world of trust, everything's much easier and everything's much more pleasant. And if you live in a world of distrust, you end up in a really sad and angry place.
How would you begin to apply your 7 rules of trust? I'm just going to kind of give you an open mic to go, you know, to anything in the book, to any specific fields where public trust is declining. The news media, science, the government in general. Want to pick one of those and match it up with one of your 7 rules?
I think a great one is to, look at one of the issues I talk about in the book, which is, and this is one of the areas people might be surprised at my view. So I thought when the Washington Post decided not to endorse a presidential candidate in the last election, I thought, well, very bad timing doing it just before the election, because that made it seem like some sort of implicit endorsement or a favor for Trump or whatever you might have viewed that as. But stepping away from the timing of it, I think there's good evidence that when newspapers endorse political candidates, it reduces trust not only with people who agree or not only with people who disagree, but also with people who agree with that endorsement, because you suddenly feel like, I like this endorsement, I agree with it, but is this paper now going to just be shilling for their political candidate? And so I think that idea of elevating neutrality or re-elevating neutrality is really important. And, you know, that the endorsement on the editorial pages is a small piece of that overall thing. But I do think it's really important, as the media has become more partisan over the years, then the trust has fallen. And there's lots of reasons for it. And, you know, we could have a whole hour-long discussion of the challenges of the business model of journalism and how that's been damaged by, you know, a lot of different factors. But the response to that, by becoming more partisan, hasn't really helped trust. And I think we should really re-examine that.
It's interesting. I guess people who did not like the Washington Post decision to stop making the endorsements would perhaps even cite some of your 7 rules of trust and, you know, like, for example, be transparent. Well, here's what our editorial board thinks is right, or who they think would be the best candidate. And then they try to pair that with, well, the news pages are separate from the editorial pages. And of course, they have to communicate that clearly, but that's your rule number 3, create a clear purpose.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think, the challenge here is I do think it's completely fine. One of the people I interview very favorable in the book is Tom Friedman, who, clearly has views, and he puts those views forward, but he makes it very clear that those are his views and not the views of the New York Times. And I think that's a fine place to be. I think that the newspaper itself as an institution should really strive to be neutral. And in fact, I think it's one of the things that a lot of news organizations should look at their hiring practices and say, look, if we have an ideologically monolithic staff of journalists, we're going to have blind spots. We're not going to understand certain stories, and we need to seek out diversity in hiring. Now, normally when we think about that, we think about minority voices, like how about people of color and things like that. But we should also think about, what about Christians? What about conservatives? Like, are we getting the full rich tapestry of humanity to take part in those discussions in the newsroom to make sure we don't have blind spots? And this is a huge challenge, of course, and I'm not suggesting it's easy, but I do think it's important.
Do you go to Trust in Science at all, or Public Health?
Definitely.
In the book?
I think it's really important. And one of the things that I talk about there is, at the very, very early stages of the pandemic, the public was told, don't bother with masks. And then, a month later, we were told masks are mandatory. And that sort of contradiction came about in no small part because the health authorities did not trust the public to take clear and honest information and not panic and buy up all the masks and cause a shortage. And I think they could have been more transparent all along, and that was a big mistake that cost a lot of trust. There's a lot of elements like that, like when you don't trust the public to be able to handle information, and so you skew it in one way. I think a lot of people in the environmental movement have been found to be a bit guilty of this, like hyping up the negatives because you feel like, you have to scare the public in order to get them to do something. So let's talk only about the negative. No, you know what? Actually, that actually may reduce people's trust when they find out that you've overhyped it. And instead to say, actually, look, here's some facts, and here's the things, and here's the things that we're not quite sure about, and all of that, which a lot of people do, and that is the right way to present science. And I think that's really important.
It's funny, those last few answers that you just gave, I don't know how many people would accuse that of being from a wokepedia.
Well, I wouldn't think so. I mean, certainly, I hope that what I stand for and what Wikipedia stands for is serious, thoughtful discourse and dialogue. And, depending on where you sit, you may feel, and you may be right, actually, that, well, gee, people on the other side are not interested in that, and that is sometimes the case. I mean, certainly, there are areas where the toxicity, for example, on social media, if you go onto X, you can find whole pockets of people who, frankly, are not the least bit interested in the truth. They're interested in campaigning for their tribe. And yeah, okay, fine. That's problematic. Those aren't the people I'm talking about.
Is that who you're being hit by, you think?
Yeah, sometimes. There's no question about that, that people have an agenda and somebody important has said we're Wikipedia, and so they jump on that bandwagon without actually pausing to take a look and to think and to listen to what we're saying. Hard to say.
Jimmy Wales, co-founder of Wikipedia, which turns 25 on January 15th. And he's the author of the brand new book, The 7 Rules of Trust, a blueprint for building things that last. Thank you so much for sharing it with us.
Well, Brian, thanks for having me on. It's been a lot of fun.
Brian Lehrer on WNYC. More to come. The Brian Lehrer Show is on tape this morning, but don't forget, we'll be here live a little before 1 o'clock when WNYC will have live coverage of Mayor Mamdani's inauguration. No calls right now, though. Brian Lehrer on WNYC. So Jay Caspian-Kang, staff writer at The New Yorker, has a new piece in his Fault Lines column asking whether quitting social media actually leads us back to reading books, or whether the relationship between our screens and our reading lives is more complicated than that familiar narrative suggests. He also raises maybe a bigger question: what does literacy even mean when we actually spend more time than ever reading, but it's online, not so much in books? Jay Caspian-Kang joins us now. Jay, always great to have you. Welcome back to WNYC.
Great. Thank you. It's good to be back.
So, Jay, last summer I see you did take a step away from social media. What did you do, and with what purpose?
Well, I was trying to finish a book, and I had a deadline coming up, and I was a little worried that I wasn't going to hit it. And so I just thought, well, if I get off Twitter, if I get off TikTok, Instagram, whatever, then I'll have some more time. And I had done this before, and it had worked. And so, I got off, and then I finished the book quite quickly after that. So I think in terms of that, it was a great way to optimize my hours into work. But I was also hoping that everything that I had read about attention spans getting shorter because of social media and the fact that short form video is particularly toxic to all of this, and that coupled with all the stuff I had read about how people don't read anymore, that this would lead me to read way more books. And I was actually quite intentional about it. I was like, all right, I'm going to try and read more books now that I don't have to read Twitter anymore. And that part of it didn't happen. And so the column I wrote was just sort of musing on why maybe that didn't happen.
What did happen? What did you do more of during your social media detox other than finish your book?
I tried to learn how to play golf, but, actually quite intensely. I went to the driving range almost every day and hit 200 golf balls, one near my house. And then that didn't go very well because of athletic limitations, I think, that I face. And so after that, I just got back on social media. But yeah, mostly it was channeled into hitting golf balls, which I would say is probably better than reading Twitter or Instagram and getting mad at your friends and colleagues. But the book part never happened, which I was, quite disappointed by because, I thought that this would be an intellectually edifying time in my life.
Listener writes, social media use has absolutely quashed my reading of magazines and books. I used to be an avid reader of anything printed on paper, and now I don't touch it. It makes me very sad. I used to have a really great attention span, and now I have zero, writes that listener. But you highlight two maybe contradictory data points. A 2022 National Endowment for the Arts survey showing that fewer than half of adults read even one book the year before, and a recent National Literacy Trust study finding that only about 1 in 5 kids reads daily for fun. But then you write, does that mean that people are less literate in general? Counterintuitively, there has never been a time in history where people have spent more time reading words, even if it's just text messages on their phones. So what's the meaning that you take from that contradiction?
Yeah, it's I started thinking about that honestly 20 years ago, even before social media really existed, and that I was in graduate school and people back then were bemoaning the death of reading because we were all trying to write novels, and there's this idea that nobody was reading anymore. And it just seemed quite obvious to me and some of my friends that people actually read more because they read websites, they read all sorts of newspapers, and they were engaged with the printed word in a way that they weren't before. And so there was always this question of, well, if you read a site 20 years ago, it would have been something like Gawker, right? And but you're not reading novels anymore. You're not reading the Financial Times or Wall Street Journal, New York Times or whatever. Is that a net loss, right, in terms of literacy? Is that a net loss in terms of what you understand in terms of the written word and how you, I guess as a writer, artistically think about what a sentence is, those types of questions. And I guess all of that has just been accelerated now where I think that we probably read all the time, all day long. If your screen time is anything like mine, over 4 hours a day where you're looking at your phone, then people weren't reading books for 4 or 5 hours a day, in our childhoods, right? Maybe an hour, 2 hours. And so people do read more and they just don't read books. And so I don't know. I think one of the questions that I have always had is just, well, is there a net loss from that? Is there a net loss from people reading something as silly as a group text with their friends or something like that compared to reading a book in a book club or whatever?
Listener writes, I uninstalled Reddit 2 weeks ago and since finished Project Hail Mary, just started Dune again. My capacity to focus at work has improved. Francesca in Jersey City, you're on WNYC. Hi, Francesca.
Okay, so I'm a 31-year-old in Jersey City, and I I have ADHD. I'm diagnosed with ADHD, and I was on medication for it and everything. And I quit like TikTok and all kinds of shorts. I deleted Instagram, all that stuff, but I kept YouTube Premium for like educational content. And I started immediately reading and like novels and stuff. And I'm actually working on my very own historical fiction novel right now, based on the pre-Israelite culture, the Canaanites.
Huh. So you think that by quitting short form social media, it's affected your attention span to the point where you're able to write a book, not just read one?
Yeah. I've always been creative. I'm a musician, and I've always written like concept records. So it was like kind of right there under the surface. And as soon as I stopped, like, with all the attention span sucking content, I had a book in me, and I just started writing it.
Francesca, thank you very much. Do you remember, Jay? There was a moment, I don't even remember where it was written or who said it, but when the internet was newer, that and at the same time there were more diagnoses of ADHD being made. Maybe just people knew how to look for it better. But the theory from somebody was that ADHD was flourishing because in the internet era it was adaptive. It was not a disease. It was an adapting to a capability that people were evolving toward. I don't know if anybody believes that anymore.
Well, I don't know. The attention span question is really interesting to me because I agree that there are ways in which terrible forms of social media can take over your life and make you feel very scattered in a way that's quite, I think, not just like, I don't even think it's bad for your attention span or your ability to concentrate. It's just unpleasant at a very base human level, right? Just to feel like there's 15 things going on. Right. But then I would say that there are YouTube videos now that are like 3 hours long, that people are recording 4-hour-long podcasts, and that people are willing to do deep dives into topics, and these are not just journalists or media people that I know, but people in my personal life, where they cover a breadth of interest and material down a rabbit hole, I think is the term that people would use, that takes an immense amount of attention, right? Yeah. And that I think that it's just different. I think that people hyper-focus a bit more because the amount of information is so large that they're able to do that. And that maybe, and this is a theory that I don't know if I even believe, but it's one that I try and posit because my column is, sometimes it's just me asking questions and thinking through them, even if I don't really know the answer. But like, is it just that we're faster at discarding the things that we're not interested in? Like, whereas in the past, maybe we were better, we weren't, because there were less options, that we were willing to be a little bit more patient with some stuff that we didn't like? Or is it like something like the fact that, like, let's say that, this is one of the hypotheticals I talk about, which is like, let's say that you're a person who is interested in military history. Before, you would have to slog through all these books that came out, and you'd go to the bookstore and you'd find some books, and maybe you didn't like them all. But then you go on Reddit, and then you find this community of people who are into military history books. And then over time, you get to know the people that you trust. And then you don't have to go through that process anymore. And that you can just kind of mainline the books that you like and the titles that you like. And that everything is kind of optimized to your taste. And I don't know. Like, I think that part of that is happening. But I also don't know if that's good, right? I kind of think that's bad. I think it's good to have like moments of boredom and social situations where you disagree that something is good, and not just to have everything so tailored to our taste.
That's where you end the piece, right? Warning about pure optimization, aggregation, and specialization, as you put it. So where do you personally land right now? Are you pro social media? I mean, you can start on Wikipedia, and one of the things I love about Wikipedia is that everything has a footnote. A little article has 100 footnotes, and you can click on that footnote, and it takes you to the original source. So for people who are curious, but then you wind up warning about that kind of thing.
Yeah, I just think I think that we have too much optimization in general, and that it makes us feel like we're that we don't need the social aspects of life and the communal in-person aspects of life if we can just skip it all, right? Like you hear people say like, well, I just don't have to do X anymore, right? I order all my groceries from Instacart. I don't even have to go to the grocery store anymore. It comes in 45 minutes. It's faster than me driving down there. I think a lot of that is happening with information gathering all over, and maybe most intensely with information gathering. And I do think it's kind of bad, because I think that what happens is that you have a consensus that builds on these types of forums that try and optimize, whether it's Twitter, right? Like sort of Twitter pushed all journalists towards one narrative, and that social media made everyone kind of think the same. And it's supposed to be this democratizing force, but through the fact that like it just filters out the most engaged with opinions, people start to only listen to those types of opinions. And it's not like talking to like 4 people in a cafe or something like that, where 3 of them might be like totally different.
We have to leave it with Jay Caspian-Kang, staff writer for The New Yorker, where he writes the weekly column called Fault Lines. Jay, thanks a lot. We appreciate it.
No, thank you.
And that's where we leave it for now. Don't forget, a little before 1 o'clock, WNYC live coverage of Mayor Mamdani's inauguration as New York City's 112th mayor.